understanding the role of the expert advisor who helps link hazard specialists and institutional decision makers. This is a panel discussion that's hosted by the WWRP project on value chains. We have a lot of our project team here tonight, but also a lot of guests and for wonderful panelists. So we're really looking forward to our discussion tonight, or this morning, or this afternoon, or wherever you happen to be. My name is Beth Ebert. I'm a scientist at the Bureau of Meteorology, and I'm the science chair of the Value Chain projects that hosts this panel discussion. And also planning this with me is David Hoffman and Kim Clucko-McLean, Bob Goldhammer, and Rob Neal. So thanks to all of the planning committee for this, and thanks to our panelists for joining us tonight. We will be recording the session, and we do have through the WWRP YouTube channel that we are going to post this on, so that if you would like to review it or share it with colleagues or whatever, that will be available for people to draw on. Before I hand over to our moderator, who will be Kim, I'd like to first acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. That's the indigenous traditional owners of the land that I'm coming to you from, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and emerging. And with that, I would like to hand over to our moderator for the panel discussion, Kim Clucko-McLean, and Kim will be our master of ceremonies, I guess, for the next 90 minutes.
Thanks so much, Beth. Well, great to see everybody at whatever interesting time it is where you are. So glad you're able to join us. And if you're listening to the recording, thank you still for taking part that way too. The first thing we're going to do today is welcome and introduce our wonderful panelists. And each of them represent a different viewpoint in this chain, and an important piece of the value chain, which is this communication between forecasters and public safety officials, emergency managers. What does that look like? What does it look like to try to connect the needs of populations, especially for emergency preparedness, response, recovery, to the meteorological community? Who are the people who are filling these gaps? What are their roles like? And can we learn from what different countries are doing, what different groups are doing? So I'm just really excited for you to even hear the introduction and bios of all of the people who will be talking with us today, to come a little bit more from the meteorological world and to a little bit more from emergency management. So let's go ahead and get started, Will, with you. Go ahead, and we gave them each a set of prompts, and if you have slides, let us know.
Oh, no, I'll just talk if that's okay.
Perfect.
Thanks, Kim. Hi everyone, great to be with you this afternoon or whatever time of day it is. I'm Will Lang from the Met Office in the UK. I used to be a forecaster. I was one of our chief forecasters for several years, so lots of experience in issuing weather warnings. But now I've moved to the right of the value chain, I guess, and now I'm in charge of the whole of the UK's National Severe Weather Warning Service. And I also lead a team of what we call in the UK Civil Contingencies Advisors. Now there are 22 of us in my team. Our job is to be embedded virtually, sometimes physically, within the UK's resilience community. So that's working with emergency services and government at all levels, local, regional, national, to interpret forecasts and warnings for their needs. So we do sit right in between, right in the middle between forecasters in the Met Office and emergency managers, in very much going native, I think, with the resilience community. The team was set up over 15 years ago now, and that was in response to UK government legislation and a law called the Civil Contingencies Act in 2004, which defines the structures and processes for planning and response to emergencies across the UK. And it sets some requirements, some weak requirements on the Met Office within that act. And so we built the advisor service on that. It's also worth noticing that these requirements also strongly influence the move in the UK towards an impact-based, indeed risk-based warning system. And that's the system that we've had in place for over 10 years and has become one of the international standards, I guess. We are always looking to improve the system. However, learning from others and away from my day job, I chair the WMO expert team, which looks at best practice in impact-based warning services. Thanks, Kim.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that great introduction. And next we'll go to Kevin.
Fabulous. Hopefully you can hear me well enough over the cable all the way from Melbourne in Australia, along with Beth, where it's a bit after midnight here at the moment. So excuse me if I come across speaking a little bit more slowly. So when it comes to the value chain, I'm essentially an embedded meteorologist, sort of one of the people that Will would probably manage, I suspect. My background is in fluid dynamics, but I've essentially been an operational meteorologist. I don't think we use the term forecaster anymore. We've sort of moved away from that now for 30 years. And in the last 13 years, I've been essentially, as Will says it, embedded within the emergency services here in Melbourne, Victoria. Now, for those that don't know Melbourne's a large city, 5 million people. It's the capital of the state of Victoria. It's a mid-latitude location. We have some of the worst fires in the world. We're also exposed to weather phenomena you would expect in sort of mid-latitude climates, such as severe storms and severe weather associated with low pressure systems. So they're the sort of weather systems that we have to sort of contend with. So my role as an embedded meteorologist in what's called the State Emergency Centre is to communicate the weather risk, the uncertainty, the predictability, the complexity to emergency managers. And in this centre, which I've got a picture here. So if I think this is probably an appropriate time to show it. So I'll share my screen. Where are we here? Or maybe in a window. So hopefully that's coming up on your screen now. So here I am just sort of presenting at this centre where a number of emergency service agencies operate. It could be fire, it could be our state emergency service that respond to severe storms and flooding and the like. But it's also a centre that basically escalates on the need facing communities in the state of Victoria. And in this centre, we could communicate. We can communicate for anywhere from the Premier of the state right through to working with technical specialists that might be flood analysts or fire behaviour analysts. So the range of, and we'll talk about this later, of course, the range of people that we can speak to is quite broad. So that gives you a bit of an idea of where I come from. I'm not a researcher, but I've got a lot of experience in the operational space in working basically shoulder to shoulder with the people making the big decisions. And I mean, just to case in point, this next one here was taken a few years ago when we had some significant fires affecting Victoria and other jurisdictions. And to the left of me is the commissioner. There's the Minister for the Emergency Services, and what you can't see is several other heads of agencies. And based on the information I'm telling and other technical specialists are telling, they're making a decision to evacuate towns. So it can be pretty high level and pretty critical decision making based on the sort of information we're communicating at the time. Thanks very much, Kim.
Thank you, and thank you too for the great visual aid. Sometimes, especially when we're talking about partnerships and working and being embedded, having that illustration of what that really looks like can be really thought-provoking and helpful. So thank you for bringing all of that. All right, we'll let the screen readjust. So with that, we'll go over to our emergency management practitioners who are a part of this panel today. And I'd like to start with David Hogg, who is actually across the building from me. He's a part of my team, the Behavioral Insights Unit at the National Severe Storms Laboratory. David, go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Yeah, like Tim said, so I'm a research associate here at the University of Oklahoma Cooperative Institute and the National Severe Storms Lab here in Norman. I've been here about a year and a half. And so prior to that, prior to coming to OU, I was an emergency management practitioner. I've spent my entire career and work in the central and southern plains of the United States, mostly in Oklahoma and Kansas. I've worked in emergency management on really a number of different levels, as far as governmentally, local level, county level, state level, and then most recently, before I came to OU, I was the emergency management coordinator for Kansas State University, so a large Division I, research university in Manhattan, Kansas. And so, being in the central southern plains, you've really experienced almost every type of hazardous weather phenomenon, save tropical storms, and even a couple of times some of the long-term impacts from those as well. But here now that I'm here at OU, I'm really the impetus for bringing me into this team and being on Kim's team was really to bring that perspective of an emergency management practitioner into the research community. And so I kind of see my work here kind of three phases or three different focus areas, if you will. One being connecting emergency managers to sort of this research to operations to research end user design of new technologies. So as other research meteorologists here at the National Severe Storms Lab are developing new technologies to communicate forecasts, bringing emergency managers in to understand those, to look at those, to interact with those, before they're released widely, so that we can, understand how they might use these kind of products, what value they bring to their operations, and even with the National Weather Service already utilizing some of these products, how they can best be communicated to their end users. So that's one area. Second area is really just trying to embed myself in a number of emergency management operations here locally and really across the nation. I do a lot of work outside of the building, which I like, but getting to interact with folks, seeing what local emergency managers are doing as far as planning, messaging, standing up before an event, and then even being with them as events are unfolding. Compared to our other two panelists that have spoken earlier, I probably have more of an emphasis on local level emergency management, kind of that lowest level of city, county level, and really a lot of rural areas. A lot of the areas that I've worked with and a lot of the folks that I currently work with are in very rural, very low resource, very low population parts of Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, the Deep South, different areas of the United States. So that's a very intentional focus to try to focus in on those kind of frontline emergency management operations. And then the third area is really looking at post-event surveying, going out to communities that have had, significant weather events, especially tornado events, and learning from the emergency managers that have gone through those events. What were they doing? What were they looking at? What were their decision timelines like? What were they utilizing to make decisions before the event? And then looking at sort of their challenges after the event in recovery and building back and really learning lessons from their experience. So those are kind of the three areas that I tend to work in as part of this group.
Thank you so much, David. And last but certainly not least, we're going to go over to Ashley Morris. Ashley, welcome to the panel.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Ashley Morris. I've been doing local level emergency management for just about 6 years now. By local level, I mean either city jurisdiction or county jurisdiction, and I've held positions all the way from Texas, doing county and city work there, as well as Northern Virginia, so Fairfax County, and then have spent the past 3 years up in Maryland doing Baltimore County emergency management, and now I just moved to Prince George's County, just outside of DC. So my ultimate role has always been preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation on a local level, which in the United States, it's really important because all of our disasters are known through policy to start and end local. So I'm very much in the trenches of emergency management. I've held roles in small and big offices where I've done preparedness, so writing emergency plans, putting on disaster scenario exercises, holding outreach events for the public. Have also participated in response, usually have done Emergency Operations Center or EOC management. Actually have a position on the Maryland Incident Management Team as Planning Section Chief, working on getting my credentials to hopefully start doing deployments to disasters and things like that, as well as recovery, so working on recovery plans, and then also mitigation, so rolling out mitigation plans as well. My role is I actually came out of university wanting to do meteorology. So I went to Texas Tech University, got my bachelor's in geophysics with an emphasis on atmospheric science, and then started the graduate program there and realized that we have such a gap between meteorology and emergency management that I really wanted to kind of try to help bridge. We had a lot of different weather incidents that happened during my school years, like the Joplin tornado and some other different hazards that went on that really pointed out that we could do everything right on the meteorology side. You can issue a perfect warning, perfect forecast, but we are still losing lives and there are still a lot of issues with communication. So I actually switched out of the atmospheric science master's program and went over to Texas Tech University's geography, GIS, and natural hazards department. Got my master's there studying social vulnerability and tornado resource access in Lubbock, and then have started this really awesome career of trying to do emergency management and trying to really bridge the two. Obviously, as an emergency manager, my role is to provide weather support. So with my multifaceted STEM background, I like to look at weather data and I like to create a weather impact forecast for our first response teams, as well as for our own EOC needs. I've done everything from EOC briefs as well as for the state, and then also usually am the NWS liaison because all of them are my friends and I understand how NWS stuff works. So usually kind of that interaction between our EOC and our local NWS office. Lastly, because I'm so passionate about trying to bridge the two fields, I'm very engaged in trying to be a liaison. So going to conferences, trying to present on different resources that the National Weather Service has that a lot of our fellow emergency managers or first responders don't know that they have, trying to really spread that information and just do the best that I can, and also do the same on the other end. So bringing emergency management to meteorologists through participation in the AMS conferences, American Meteorological Society meetings, as well as the National Weather Service or the National Weather Association. So that's a little bit about me.
Thanks so much, Ashley. Between you and David, then we see that you are trying to both help emergency managers get plugged into what already exists in the U.S. Weather forecast and warning system and the different pieces of information, products they might be able to use. And then David, you're talking about the future of those systems and bringing emergency managers into the development process. So we're so excited to have all of those viewpoints. Thank you all. I'll give you all a brief introduction to myself as the moderator for those that I haven't had the opportunity to meet in the past. I'm Kim Clocko-McLean, and I'm the team lead for the National Severe Storms Lab's Behavioral Insights Unit. What we focus on here is sort of two big parts. But we're really interested in taking a user-centered design perspective and following a co-production process for working with our physical science counterparts in the lab, what David was describing, helping them to not just create things because the science can, but to create with an eye to there's value somewhere for a particular set of users, and we should create the things that they need. And maybe it's not the most sophisticated, intricate technological solution, but there can be a set of different kinds of priorities our users can have, and let's meet them where they are. So that's the perspective from our work that I'll bring in as a moderator today, trying to bridge these worlds, because that's really an essential piece of creating that value. And all of our panelists today are doing this and can speak to it in such interesting ways. So our first prompt today is something, Kevin, you touched on explicitly in your introductory remarks, is something that's a part of your work. So I'm curious about forecast uncertainty, communicating it. It's tough. Forecasters, do you feel like you have sufficient forecast guidance and information about the risks to your community to produce the forecast you would like to provide to public safety officials from the beginning? Kevin, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, sure. It's been quite the journey. I think back to the early 90s when I sort of started in the role and using basically numerical model guidance to assist in the forecast process. We've come a long way. In fact, it's, as you would have seen in my bio, it's really been an explosion of weather intelligence, I'll call it, as a sort of collective word. I think one of the main roles that I have, and it's a real skill, it's being able to access the right information at the right time, and sifting through everything you need to access it. It's a real skill. There's a lot that can be communicated to emergency managers, but to do that successfully, communicating and accessing that successfully is quite the skill. So getting back to the question at heart, which is, do I have access to the weather intelligence? I'm happy to receive anything from the modelers that helps me do my role, and we've certainly come a long way in being able to use ensemble guidance to represent probabilities. But I'm always reticent to sometimes show too much to the emergency managers to assist them in their decision making. It has to be quite targeted. I mean, Ashley sort of touched on it, and I'm sure this is part of Will's kit bag. You only want to show the information needed for them to make the appropriate decision. So you've then got to step back and work out, well, what decision is that? What is that? What are their needs? What is the greatest risk? Because there's no use showing them what you think they need to see. What I might do is I'll talk about just quickly 3 areas that I really focus on when I talk to emergency managers when presenting weather information. And I break it down quite simply because it can be overwhelming, the weather information for emergency managers to make decisions. And I put it in 3 baskets. One's preparedness, sort of weather intelligence that assists with preparedness. And that's usually, beyond the current 24 hours. There's the weather intelligence that assists you with situation awareness. And then there's weather intelligence that is basically focused on the going incident. So everything that is outside that is impacting it isn't an incident is sort of irrelevant. You're really focused. And I want to just quickly share with you one bit of intelligence that we use that I find is quite useful in communicating weather for decision making. Okay, it's not. I don't think that's what I want to show. I want to show this. Here we go. Not sure why it hasn't come up as a full screen, but we'll work it out.
If it helps, I'm at least seeing it as a full screen.
You are. That's good. Thank you. Thanks for that.
Yeah, it's full screen. Yeah.
Beautiful. So this is a pretty common sort of weather information you might share with your emergency management colleagues. It's from a high resolution ensemble model. I'm sure Beth is very happy I'm showing this. It's showing 25% chance of rainfall in a 12-hour period. It's actually probably closer to a sort of a 4 to 6 hour period. And your eye is immediately drawn to the yellows and oranges, which is, you know, the purpose of this type of information when you're communicating, indicating, you know, rainfall potentially in that sort of 80 to maybe as much as 100 millimeters locally over a few hours. So that's great information to share, but my role then obviously is to assist in the interpretation of it. And when I show information like this, I need to communicate it in terms of the weather system or the weather phenomena that might be producing this rainfall. So in this case, it's convectively driven. And so then you've got to think, well, if it's convectively driven, what are the features that are triggering the convection? In this case, it's a combination of a trough line and some topography. Now, so when you know that, you can then say, well, the way I would communicate this would be, don't focus so much on where the highest rainfall is occurring. What that's telling us is that the atmosphere is capable of supporting rainfall totals of this amount, but it might not be exactly in that location, but near, you know, near there or somewhere in the region. And that's really important because emergency managers will get this information and may tend to use it as a black box unless you've got the that sort of background information that helps them use this reliably to inform decision making. Now, what I'm just providing in the top right, you might not be able to see it clearly, but it's the rainfall that occurred during that time. And as it turned out, the heaviest rainfall was about 50 kilometres further north, closer to what we call our dividing range. So yeah, this is really important to, in my role, is to choose the right information, and I use a lot of ensemble guidance, and we'll probably expand on this, but then it's about interpreting it, and then we'll talk later about the sort of language that we use when we interpret this. Just a bit of an example of how I go about my business, and some of the intelligence that we're using to sort of communicate, which is probably pretty familiar.
This is great. So your answer to the question is, in part, you're not just relying on products to do the talking. You recognize that there needs to be some kind of interpretive layer here, or something that you have pursued as the best way to reconcile this challenge that can arise when there is forecast uncertainty, to help emergency managers and forecasters be on the same page. It's a human endeavor where there's a person who has to be in that chain. Great. I'm really interested then in hearing from our other forecaster. And I see Will, if we can pull up his square. Love to hear your perspective on this question.
Yeah, I'm glad I'm next. Thanks, Kim, because I wanted to come straight back in and agree with Kevin and pick up with something that you said. We cannot rely on products to do the talking, I think, in this space. I think knowing what to communicate with users is really the $1 million question. There is so much information, especially probabilistic information, obviously. So what do we filter out? What do we pass on? How much do we simplify? What language do we use? And I really don't think there's a single methodology or product set that can be used there. Every situation is so different. Every location is different. Every user is different. Their sensitivities will change too. We shouldn't also underestimate the importance of individuals here. A lot of this is communication between individuals. Everyone has different styles, preferences, risk appetites, and that can be hugely important. I think we have a range of options to communicate risk, especially when it comes to warnings. It's probably a bit of an irony that the headline thing about warnings, at least in the UK, that's the colour, that's really totally insufficient. And you do need to go deeper with whatever user you're talking about, whether it's public or emergency services. As I mentioned in the introduction, we use this risk matrix approach to warnings in the UK, so impacts and likelihood. We put a lot of emphasis on the matrix position in the warning as well as the color, particularly when we deal with emergency services, but even that might not be enough to tell the story effectively, especially those probabilistic aspects. So we often go deeper to explain, for example, how our confidence and the impact assessment is changing over time. So what we found is another really important approach is what is our warning strategy? So imagine we've got these warnings issued for the weekend and they're in force today, but actually, where do we think we might be tomorrow? Might things escalate? Might things drop off? Or can we rule out this becoming a higher impact event or even a red warning? So which outcomes are within this? It's kind of like a phase space approach, if you like, to the current situation. So there are possible outcomes for each situation in terms of warnings. Which of those are on the table and which can we rule out? That's really, really vital information for lots of emergency responders and indeed, the public and broadcasters alike. Very often in the UK, and this is because of our position within a long established position within government risk management, we like to use scenarios to summarize the probabilistic information. So the probabilities themselves are probably too much. So what we do is simplify that through creation of best estimate and reasonable worst cases. One thing I'm aware of, and this is a human aspect, is that there is a selection bias into the decision in the first place to create it and then to communicate a reasonable worst case. And I think having done that with subconsciously thinking that it actually has a good chance of happening, these reasonable worst cases. And indeed, I have it back from my colleagues within government that as soon as we define a reasonable worst case and communicate to them, that's often what they expect will eventually happen. I suspect the reality is somewhere in between, but again, that seems to be an effective approach for us. Another thing which I wanted to talk about, which was probably more developed on our public communication side, but is equally applicable across emergency managers, is that there is a major focus on what we want people to do when they receive a warning. So it's not just about telling them the weather or even just the impacts anymore. There is a healthy dose of behavioral psychology coming into our profession. So again, I'm going to refer to our risk matrix. I wish I had a graphic with me, but I didn't bring one. But so for each box in our warnings risk matrix, we found that there is an optimum different way of communicating. So a different framing argument to get people to understand what's going on, different ways of presenting advice, different language, and different ordering of advice statements, for example, in order to achieve the best overall response. And also the type of weather event and the demographics of the user are very important too. So this approach, is work that we've done for the public, but it applies more widely, as of course emergency managers and politicians are also people too, and subject to the same human foibles and the same techniques, and nudge theory, if you like, can be used there as well. I guess I want to get back to supporting Kevin's point. I think risk communication is necessarily very dynamic and is dependent on, I think, on a two-way conversation, so a dialogue with users. Only then can we really get across a message. In fact, I would go as far as to say, and this gets back to my point right at the beginning, that this is something that needs human beings, expert intermediaries, be they advisors, broadcast meteorologists, etc., to be able to work out what's going on, understand what users' needs are on a day-by-day, hour-by-hour basis, and tailor the message appropriately. Thanks.
There's so much in that I am so interested in just thinking through the US system and some of the things we're wrestling with. And I am inspired by the model you're putting forward. And I also just really appreciate something that you mentioned is you're not just focused on the forecast now, but you're focused on how it changes. Implicit in that is a recognition that the people that we're communicating with, they have decisions that are evolving over time, just as the forecasts evolve over time. And what can be so important for them to know is what are our changes and what do we anticipate changing so that they can do their decisions that also unfold over time. So I want to turn now to our emergency managers. Now that we've heard a little bit from our forecasters who embed and relate, I'm curious if your role in emergency management, emergency preparedness involves or has maybe in the past involved communication with partner organizations. What do you communicate? So you yourself are a sort of forecast communication intermediary to other groups that the forecasters maybe aren't reaching directly. They're your partners. And what do you wish was communicated to public safety officials by forecasters? Is there anything that could help you in that task where you are an intermediary communicator? I'll start with Ashley in our, current practitioner role.
Yeah, sure. So I think after doing this for a few years and trying to develop the best way to share forecasts with first response personnel, public health, and all of our different partners, I learned that it's really important to take the time to discuss uncertainty, but break it down of why. Because we obviously get a lot of forecasts from the National Weather Service that give us uncertainty, and that's great. But I feel like my partners need to know why they're uncertain. And it also helps them understand why a forecast might go a certain way or not go a certain way. So I've really worked hard to try to break down the why, whether or not I'm kind of explaining the simplistic versions of how models are diverging or we're getting different solutions. I also try to take the time to kind of simplistically explain about observations and just some of those like really root level NWP things. I think sometimes scientists think that we can't understand it, and I think they're right to a degree, but I think that if we can break it down to a level to where we can understand why it's uncertain, how the forecast is made, etc., we're probably going to gain a lot more trust from public safety, and then also we're going to be able to understand what this uncertainty thing means. I will say I am currently doing a study on weather training for emergency managers right now because I'm a part of the FEMA Advanced Academy. And so I'm taking a look at what weather trainings we currently provide to emergency managers, as well as what we're not very good at based on some case studies. And there is a lot of research that already shows that emergency managers are not solid at understanding probability. So if they don't understand probability or uncertainty, obviously we either need to provide additional training on that or work on better ways to communicate that with them. And then also too, just focusing, like I said, on providing training and education on how we put forecasts together. What is a model? Why are there different models that I see on the internet with the Euro or the NAM or whatever? What does that mean simplistically? And then explaining that in training, I think, once again, will understand and allow emergency managers to better grapple with where the error comes from and just different things like that. So that's kind of my focus on being that multidisciplinarian who can see the both sides and trying to translate from one to the other.
Thank you. Really great perspective, and something in there that's really important is to recognize emergency managers, especially here when there's so many working at all of the local levels across this fairly large country. They're very different, very, very different people, which will bring me to David. Would love your thoughts on this.
So I have notes I've been jotting down, and it's funny because almost everything I've written down has been brought up by either Will or Kevin or Ashley. So I'm going to start just with what you said there, Kim. This idea that the emergency management profession itself is evolving and is changing, and there are vast differences in what is an emergency manager, how do they view their role, what is their local expectation of their partners, what do they think they're going to get from their emergency manager. And because every jurisdiction is a little bit different, it's very hard for something that's in a way more monolithic, like the National Weather Service here in America, to hit every emergency manager. And so just even being aware of that, I think is important. To Ashley's point, I think the training and the gaps that exist there among emergency managers, it is a very real problem in the sense that most of the training that emergency managers do are focused on response, focused on responding to events, not making decisions before the event, not preparedness, not understanding the science necessarily. There's a very strong response bias in the training that's available right now. And so having training, again, not incredibly in depth, but even just an awareness of where to go to find good information is something that doesn't exist in a lot of places and that isn't common for emergency managers in the United States. I think one thing that a couple of you have hit on is this idea of emergency managers often as sort of knowledge brokers within their jurisdiction, where oftentimes it may not be the emergency manager themselves that is making operational decisions, but they're receiving information from a reliable source, a knowledgeable source, and then they're having to turn around and share that information to their partners, their stakeholders, whether that be other first response agencies, whether it be schools, hospitals, shelters, different groups within their community. And it's those sort of secondary users that are actually making the decisions. And so having an emergency manager that can contextualize and understand, hey, here's this larger forecast, but here's what it means for our jurisdiction. And here's what it means for our unique vulnerabilities, our unique geography, our unique, calendar, what's going on in our community at this moment. Having someone that can take that information and add that context in to then turn it around, I think is incredibly, incredibly important. And that really brings, I think, up another instance of this idea of uncertainty. And Kim, you and I talk about this a lot because we're geographers. This idea that an emergency manager is looking through a different frame of reference often than a meteorologist is. Where I'll use here in Norman, for example, of our local National Weather Service Forecast Office covers 2/3 of Oklahoma and parts of Northwest Texas. And so when they talk about uncertainty in forecasts, they're talking about a very large geographic area. Whereas most of the emergency managers I'm looking at or working with are covering at most one county, maybe only one city. And so their geographic frame is so very different of understanding within that larger geography, what is my localized uncertainty for this event? And then again, has been brought up, how that changes over time and the needs of the emergency manager and the community when you're talking about a potential severe weather event multiple days out. And as you get closer to that event, how their needs and the kind of information they're looking for changes with time. What their expectation is of confidence, what their expectation is of sort of narrowing that focus in. And the last thing I'll say is I completely agree with Ashley. I have found that adding in that why information when we talk about uncertainty builds trust and builds confidence. When we treat our partners like adults and we treat them like oftentimes scientists or professionals and give them additional information to explain why. I mean, honestly, today's a great example. Here in Western Oklahoma, Central Oklahoma, we have a very conditional severe weather risk. Odds are good, nothing will happen today. That's the most likely scenario. But there's a very slim chance that if something were to form, it could be fairly severe. I mean, there's a parameter space here where there is the potential for something, most likely nothing. But explaining to my partners why that's the case, that we have, a strong capping inversion, we have very limited forcing, those kind of things, I think helps them to trust, oh, they're not just saying this because they don't know the answer. They're trying to convey there are all these little pieces within the atmosphere that we just don't know how it's going to play out yet. So I'm a very strong proponent of sharing the why with our partners.
Reflecting on everything you guys have said as a whole, you're really getting at this idea that warnings really aren't just a technology. Warnings and forecasts in general, it's not just about technologies, they're social processes. And all of you are working as intermediaries crossing this boundary with and forging this relationship. And I'd love to move to a question about what it's like to be that person in the middle. What's the biggest challenge you face as that person in the middle? And maybe if you could embellish a little bit more on within the organizational institutional structures you're embedded in, how do you make it work? Is it something that was top-down created and has a lot of support? Is it something that's been forged bottom-up? Kevin, let's start with you.
Great question, because I can speak pretty directly to this. The role that I've been in for 13 years now was created because the emergency management agencies in Victoria wanted it. They were crying out for a meteorologist to explain to them, the weather, answer their questions, perhaps provide, as David was saying, that extra little bit of intelligence. And let's face at the emergency management level anyway, the people I deal with, they've got a pretty reasonable appetite for weather intelligence. And over the 13 years, I guess I've taken them on a journey, and I am able to perform my role better because they understand the weather better over that time. So yeah, it's really been very interesting. And David mentioned expectations. I think a big part of the role I perform is managing expectations. There's, oh, this is the forecast. Well, yes, this is the forecast, and Will talked about, you know, most likely or worst case scenarios, and we do talk about that to some extent. And it was interesting, David, just talking about, you know, a capping inversion, which if it erodes, you know, could get some explosive development. Using that sort of language, we wouldn't have been able to do, you know, probably 20 years ago. But now, when you're embedded in amongst the emergency services, you can, and you can share information with them that help illustrate that point. So managing expectations is a big part of the role. I know it doesn't come back to the initial point of, you know, am I getting the right weather intelligence to be able to do that? But it's the communication part just cannot be underestimated. And we've probably got social scientists here with us, and part of that communication, of course, is probably more about how you communicate it. You know, the not only the language, but the tone in your voice and the body involvement in explaining a weather risk carries perhaps more weight than even the weather intelligence that you show them. Trying to get that across to meteorologists who have worked in an operational centre with other meteorologists, and bringing them out and then working in emergency management is an unbelievable experience. And it has been interesting for me to behold, because I've been on this journey, to make them realise that it's fantastic, you've got access to all this information, but it is how you communicate it is what it boils down to. I think it doesn't care how good the information is. I could have access to the most accurate models in the world, but if I can't communicate it correctly to the right people at the right time, then I don't see me performing my role. So yeah, managing expectations, big part of the role. Thanks, Kim.
Absolutely. Managing expectations, managing a relationship is a big challenge in being in that space. Will, I'd love your perspective on this question. What's a big challenge that you face in that role? And if you have any other reflections too on just the creation of your role and support for it, we'd be happy to hear.
Yeah. I think it can feel uncomfortable sometimes being in the middle, and I guess not just as an individual or even a team. I think organizationally, it feels like we can sometimes be in a grey area between science, communications, and the pragmatic needs of emergency managers and the whole machinery of risk. I think we've increasingly learned to push ourselves out of our comfort zone into that grey area space a little bit, away from the hard science. Judging when to say something. So I'll give you some examples of that. I think we're increasingly comfortable with going earlier than the raw science might suggest us, or our scientific comfort zone might suggest that we would have done in the past. And going out there and embracing a story and controlling the narrative. Often that's really, really necessary, as the story, so the chance of an impending severe weather event will already be out there in the press, or maybe pundits on social media. So there is a need to go early to acknowledge, challenge, support whatever the existing narratives are out there, and that might be earlier than we might have expected in the past. So nowadays we do like to take charge of the story well in advance of issuing warnings. We do like to set the scene with public and emergency responders as well. So, for example, the heat wave that we had last July in the UK So that's when we saw 40 Celsius for the first time. We acknowledged the potential there and pushed to become the lead for that story nearly 2 weeks ahead. Initially, because that potential was being highlighted in some of the model runs publicly available, so the GFS model, for example. So once we're happy that scientifically that was a physically, realistically possible outcome, so that's like understanding model characteristics, etc., then we have to decide whether, and what we did, we started to create useful risk information that people could work with and a story around that. So we can quantify the risk, as I said, creation of reasonable worst case scenarios, and that gives us a basis to kickstart awareness in government and from emergency managers. So this is like a week to 2 weeks in advance. And I think because we've done that, government and responders have become increasingly comfortable with us doing that as well, just flagging up the what ifs, the low probability, high impact scenarios. Of course, that also means that we can compare our risk with other risks. So the weather risk versus the other concerns that are going on at the moment. In the UK last summer during the heat wave, it was concerns around pressures on emergency services for various other reasons. The previous summer, it was COVID. So there's always something else that's going on in the world of risk. And so it's understanding how that fits in with that whole holistic risk picture is vital, both for us to be able to issue the impact-based warnings, but actually for government to be able to plan and respond, and emergency responders as well. Then it's about managing that authoritative view. So this is about being consistent with all customers all the time, maintaining that consistency as the story evolves, as the focus narrows, as Dave said, or sometimes it doesn't. That doesn't mean one size fits all, though. Again, it's not one single set of products. It's not one single, bit of text or single media story. Part of taking users with us is to be able to tailor that story to local level, to organizational level. What does it mean for you? What does it mean for your particular risks? So that's what we try and do, and that is a major task, actually. There's all the forecasting that has to go on, the decision making around the meteorology, etc., but maintaining that narrative and keeping it consistent across all of our customers, taking them with us, making them retain trust in the warning service in the Met Office, that's a major drain on our resources, and it could be quite exhausting for all of us, I think, in that space, particularly for something that goes on for a week or more. But that's it. It's using a single underlying story that is projected out consistency along all customers and taking them with us as it evolves. I think that's all I have. Thanks, Kim.
Yeah, I mean, so to the earlier point of this is all the forecast and its interpretation is best managed through relationship. You're reflecting on the massive effort and undertaking it is to maintain those relationships over the event life cycle and multiple events. So very interesting human dynamic to the interpretation of forecast information and the production of it and communication. So I'd love to hear some of the perspectives on this question of working in this in-between relational space from our emergency management folks. David, let's start with you. What do you see as the biggest challenge you face as a person in the middle?
Sure. I think, honestly, things that both Kevin and Will said, I can relate to. One thing that I think is maybe a little different that I'll bring up is just the idea of credibility. Of what makes me or my voice more credible or as credible as what else they may be hearing or seeing. I know Will mentioned, people on social media or, these other voices that may be out there, and that we know that people are seeking out and looking at. Here in Oklahoma, there's obviously, weather is a competitive space. There is a very real competition locally, both on social media, traditional media, for eyeballs. And so I think, and again, it comes back to relationships, right? It's having built a relationship with people to where they know what's my motivation, what is motivating me to be in this space, to provide information. Am I doing it to try to gain a following? Am I doing it to try to, out forecast or, outdo someone else? Or am I doing it because I'm really trying to, have the best interest of my jurisdiction in mind and the best interest of my partners in mind? And what I found is that, building that trust, building that relationship over time, people begin to see that and understand that, and it really does make a difference. The other thing I'll say is that related to that is the ability or the willingness to be there to answer questions. Not making someone feel stupid, not making them feel dumb, not to be condescending, and not to be annoyed when someone asks a question, but being a voice that someone, I've got a number of people that I work with now, and when I was at Kansas State, especially, that somebody can text me and say, "Hey, I saw this. What do you think?" Or, "Hey, we have this coming up. What do you think about this?" And just being available and welcoming of those kind of things goes such a long way in building that trust.
So the stress of maintaining the relationship and having empathy when and that full recognition that there are different kinds of expertise and knowledge on both sides of the relationship. Very interesting dynamic. And Ashley, coming to you, would love your thoughts on that question about what's most difficult about working in that in-between.
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to approach it from both lenses. So starting with the weather lens, looking at emergency management, I think one of the biggest challenges that hit me in the face right when I started was just the lack of trust already in the field towards meteorologists and trying to figure out how to change mindsets. So, if I had a quarter for every time someone made a joke about getting paid to be wrong, or they don't know what they're doing, or yada, yada, I would be very rich and I'd be at home. I wouldn't be working. And that gets a little frustrating, but you have to look at it through a lens of more of an educational and a relationship and credibility and trust lens, like everybody is talking about. And I think we can really only do that if we continue to work together, build those relationships, and then, of course, add additional training to assess why emergency managers think that. And that's where I was kind of getting with my last answer. Another thing I would like to see is data-driven change in emergency management. And I know coming from STEM, science, and taking a look at weather data and applying it in emergency plans, hazard mitigation projects, or even response, our field is notoriously bad at operating on gut feelings and wishes over using data. We're getting a little better at that, but we are still miles and miles and miles behind where that really needs to be. And until our field kind of adapts that mindset, we're still going to continue to struggle with using flood modeling or projections or whatever really cool data we're trying to get from all these SMEs. It's just not going to happen. Another answer too is training, like I mentioned. So in emergency management, we have no required training in the United States for anything. That's weather training, that's instant command stuff. Even though there's the NIMS compliance point, nobody really checks it. So as an emergency manager, it's very frustrating to see us run a field that has not developed a professional development requirement on what kind of skills that we're going to be having. Personally, I think we need to set that, and a part of that needs to be weather-related training. Understanding where forecasts come from, understanding how to apply forecast information to what we're doing. Understanding all of those things need to be kind of an aspect of that, but we're going to continue to struggle with that until we kind of set the standard of what emergency managers do and what training they receive from coast to coast and not state to state. Lastly, I did want to kind of point out too, the National Weather Service has done a phenomenal job of creating different resources and their own training and their own initiatives on trying to help us be educated in the field. But something that I see as a really big challenge is there's just a lot of diversity and change and difference in what National Weather Service offices are doing from coast to coast, depending on their region or what initiatives they're taking on or whatever. And so once again, we have that disparity in emergency management between what offices are teaching other people certain things and things like that. So that's something that I would like to see tightened up. And then still looking through that same lens, just dealing with the politics. So having a challenge of knowing that I can look at the data, I can portray the data to our first response, and even in the EOC, we could all agree on the data. But with decision making, with evacuation and even event planning and stuff, a lot of the legality of that is out of our hands. We have to deliver that to elected officials or whoever is in charge of that decision and hope that we can convey it in a way that is important to them. So that's always going to be kind of frustrating and a challenge, I think, as emergency management confronts that. Lastly, to ramp it up or to roll it all up, because I know I've got a lot of different points, just taking a look at the EM size of weather. I think just continue to work with the weather industry and having them come to the table to actually take a look at what we need, right? Timing graphics, crafting products, stuff like that. It's going to continue to build that bridge that we really need. And like I mentioned, Weather Service is doing an awesome job of that. And I think the meteorological field has seen the need for all of this great change. And what I want to see emergency managers do is take steps on the bridge as well, because it feels like NWS and everybody is trying to bridge the gap way more than we are. So I hope that we can kind of change that initiative.
That is all such valuable insight. So hard to be someone who's sort of the honest broker of risk information and not the one making the decisions. That is a tough role to play. Beth, following the question I saw Bob just asked in the chat, it was at this point, I think, that we had thought that we would open things up for questions. Do you want to do that? Or maybe I could ask the technology question and people could be putting questions into chat. What do you prefer?
I was sort of hoping we could do a little bit on the technology, but and at the same time, people can put their questions in the chat, and then as the moderator, Kim, I think you can have a look and see which looks like the most juicy questions.
Absolutely.
Okay.
All right. Well, folks, please go ahead and start populating the chat with any questions that you have. And while you do that, I'll have one last question that's a prepared question for our panelists. So yeah, let's talk technology. You guys are talking so much about the relationships you have to foster among all of these groups, and that has to involve technology. Do the systems that are available today enable or constrain these interactions? Do you have staff that are working across organizations that have access to both organization systems? What does that look like? Is tech integrated, or do you live in separate islands, public safety officials utilizing one set of systems and weather forecasters utilizing another? And I'd love to start again with our forecaster side. Will, let's start with you this time. How does that look?
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, a kind of double-edged sword, I guess. Overwhelmingly positive in terms, and I think it's a massive enabler and indeed a requirement to be able to successfully use technology and data. I guess getting data into user systems, that's now the main way to get value from weather information via apps, dashboards, gives us a lot of reach, gives us a lot of other organizations exposure to our data. We've now learned to get that data out there. I'm thinking of a time like 5 years ago, even in the Met Office, where we realized we didn't have enough bandwidth to get most of our data out of the building in Exeter. That's changed now. It's all out there. It also gives us the ability to offer up that data, to mash it all up with other risk data in the way that I said earlier, to create this sort of more holistic risk picture. So that's a really positive thing. But I end up looping back to what I said before. There's a note of caution here. And this is the conversations we've had with central government. They're putting together what they call a situation center, where they suck up data feeds from various other organizations to mash up risk data. We've said to them many times, yes, we can give you so much data, you don't know what to do with it. But there'll be times, well, I'll tell you it's all wrong. And so what I come back to here is the role of the human interpretation, or at least the kind of in the loop or over the loop view of actually you need someone there to interpret it. And I do worry of weather data feeding into some black box, which misses out on our expert interpretation.
So just to clarify for my edification, I'll take moderator's prerogative here and follow up. The technologies that you are using, part of it was this challenge of getting data out. So you need the ability to pull data as you need it to tell your story. But the system itself is a communication system where both you and the emergency responder communities are in the same platform, working together, just you're sort of in that role of putting it all together and assembling the message. Is that what that looks like?
Well, that's the new application through this situation centre. So they need to have the UK government aspiration to have a holistic and, I guess, data-driven risk pictures.
Okay, that's the aspiration. Okay, great. Kevin, let's go to you. What does this look for you?
Technology. Yeah, we've come a long way there too, haven't we? Where I work in the integrated centre, where all the emergency agencies operate out of as required, depending on the emergency, scalable up and down. We're sort of all integrated onto the same system in terms of sharing of information technology. In my role, it's it's very much a briefing role, communicating weather information, showing weather information. The main platform we use is WebEx. Obviously, there's many others that can be used, and that is pretty much used by all emergency managers in the state. And there was a question, or part of this discussion was about the sort of audience, the information that we communicate, but at every level, whether it's from the premier all the way down to an incident control centre, or even a crew leader on a fire tanker, they have access to this system where I might be sharing weather intelligence. It might be a standard briefing that I do, which is typically at 1 o'clock every day. I share my screen with, sometimes several hundred of my closest colleagues in the emergency services, or it could be just a select group of regional managers. So that's the platform that we use to share information on. Everything else seems to work okay. No issues with bandwidth at the moment, so which is good. But I do want to leave on one point. We talk about. I talk a lot about weather intelligence and the richness of it, and there's often so much I want to share, but can end up just confusing the situation. And I often think about weather information like maps. Some people have got it, some people don't. They look at a map and don't know which way it's pointing, where they are on the map, geographically challenged. And I just want to share something with you, and Will like this. Stay with me, Will. Where are we? Yeah, this is the one. Okay, so what makes a good map, or what makes good weather intelligence that you want people to understand and make decisions of? And I can think of no greater example of that than the London Metro. I mean, how good is that? That is very complex. I mean, if someone said to you, how do you get from the centre of London out to Golden Green or something like that? Well, just show them this. And I mean, I've pinched this from somebody, and it gets back to the. I know you want to talk about technology, but I really wanted to make this point that you can still have access to the greatest technology, but if you can't explain it so people understand it, then you're heading down the wrong path. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was familiarity. The example I gave around everyone using the same platform to access me sharing weather information, it goes even deeper than that. We get consistent feedback, and I'd be interested to hear others' point of view on this, that if I'm showing weather information, they want to see it in the same format that they're used to seeing it every day. Don't show me something new that I'm not used to seeing, unless it's well explained and you plan on continuing to show it as part of whatever the briefing you're doing. And for God's sake, make sure it's labelled well. There's nothing worse than going to a presentation showing a great map with isoplex of something if you have no legend and things like that. So again, great to have the technology, but it's sometimes the simple things that can really make the difference. Thanks, Kim.
You just spoke straight to the heart of this geographer. I love that reflection on it's not just the existence of a communication platform, but your good use of it, your wise use of it, the way that you're communicating information through it. So it's part of it is having the platform to be able to relate together, and then part of it is leveraging it wisely. So with that, I think we'll have some really interesting reflections on this in the US context from our emergency management crew. I'll start over with Ashley. Ashley, I'd love your comments on technology to communicate between forecasters and emergency managers. What systems are they operating on? Is anything integrated? To what extent? What do you wish was integrated?
So kind of based on my discussion from my last answer, we do not use technology well in emergency management. I wish that we would use it a lot better. And I think based on your location and your jurisdiction and your funding, you might have better sources of technology that you're using in your emergency operations center or for planning analysis or what have you. But if I'm thinking about technology between the two fields, I always have to say NWS chat, which is super basic, but it's still communication. So technology to be able to communicate back and forth in real time. And I'm really excited about Chat 2.0 and having an opportunity to maybe even be able to throw like pictures in the chat, damage pictures, whatever. I think there's such a huge value with being able to communicate with our weather professionals back and forth like that. Obviously, we do have some dashboards and stuff that we can use, but in my site or my purview, I don't really see there's not really a connection between meteorology and emergency management combined. Like we're kind of using these technologies that either somebody makes for us or we buy, and there's no really bridge of the gap between the two fields.
Absolutely. And David, I'm sure you have other thoughts to add to that too.
Yeah, so I'll jump in here with building on something that Ashley said that I think is where we're seeing challenges right now is in the alerting and warning space, where more and more emergency management agencies locally are using alerting softwares that allow for wireless emergency alerts to go out to cell phones automatically. What we're seeing is this, and not everywhere, but we've seen enough examples of emergency managers either not understanding how to use that technology correctly, or essentially going over the top of existing National Weather Service warning technology. So the Weather Service will issue an advisory, a warning that will go out to wireless emergency alerts, and then a local emergency management agency will issue their own, and they don't match. They don't use the same wording. They don't have the same geographic scope. They don't have the same timing. And what we're finding is that a lot of times it is an issue not of ill intent. It's usually not an issue of the emergency manager trying to issue something different than what the Weather Service has done. They just don't understand their technology. They have not had adequate training. They don't understand the implications of what they're doing, or they're just, it's sort of that in the moment, I have to do something, so I'm going to issue this. And it's creating some level of confusion between official warning messaging from the Weather Service and then what that local agency is doing. So wireless emergency alerts are an area that have tremendous potential, but are creating sort of this challenge within the United States and a lot of jurisdictions. Back to something that Ashley said, NWS Chat as a platform for sharing information is just tremendous. And I'll speak a little bit to the question that Brian had in the chat about lower resource areas. I feel like that's really the goal of NWS Chat, is to provide that kind of sort of personalized, in the moment, additional value added information, where an emergency manager can ask a question of a forecaster at the National Weather Service and get an answer, or can share things back and forth. And so, from a technology standpoint, that's great. The downside, like Ashley mentioned, is that historically NWS Chat has been a very low resource, low prioritized technology. And so it has a history of failure. It has a history of failure in some of the most extreme events that we've had. And it's also very regional. I mean, the from office to office, from state to state, the way that NWS Chat is utilized is very different. We've seen that as we've brought emergency managers into experiments here at the NSSL in the hazardous weather test bed, and forecasters as well, where we will bring forecasters in, from the eastern region, so areas where Ashley is, bring them into experiments and use NWS Chat the way we do in Oklahoma, And we get this confusion of like, wait, we don't use this way. Our emergency managers don't talk to us like this. And so there's a very large difference geographically based on how this technology is being utilized. The last thing that I wanted to mention really quick to one of Kevin's points, I love the weather intelligence, just that terminology. I love that. I've actually worked some in more traditional intelligence related activities with the Department of Homeland Security. And I think one thing that I try to think about when I'm communicating through that lens is what's actionable. What of this intelligence is actionable for a jurisdiction or for a stakeholder group versus what is just additional information? What's just fluff? What's just, hey, that's really neat that we can show this, but it really doesn't have any actionable use as well. So I love that framing of weather as intelligence.
Yeah, that is all so interesting with technology. You've all reflected on the different ways. It's not just what's available, but how we use it and what's leveraged together. How coordinated is that? So a very interesting set of opportunities and challenges. Well, at this point, I think I know we will need to wrap the event in about 10 minutes. So I want to bring a question from the audience in. I too thought that Brian's question was a really nice piece for discussion. And we'll ask this question and then give you all just a minute or two to add any pressing things that you think you haven't brought up but would really like to, given the exchange that's taken place. So let me read Brian's question. He thanks everybody for the fantastic discussion and then asked if we could comment on the issue of limited capacity. Not every National Weather Service, or he assumes emergency management agency, can or believes they can afford a crew of Ashleys, Davids, Kevins, and Wills. Are there other models of co-production and exchange that might not require these continuous functions and roles in the human form that we've been discussing? I know it's a tough one.
I'll have a go at that if you want, Kim, as well.
Go ahead, Will.
Again, I'm going to say everyone's different. So every country is different, every structure is different, and there'll be a different setup and a way of doing this. What I would say is fundamental is that there is a need for some kind of translation, interpretation, user dialogue layer somewhere in the system. That doesn't have to be in the Met Service. It could be in the government, could be elsewhere, but there is a need, and it doesn't even have to be a specific dedicated team, just some kind of function that bridges that link to the users, and I guess spans that valley of death, because this is one of those classic valleys of death that we often talk about.
There was an idea in our National Weather Service. I'm not sure if it's even still around. It might be in some limited form, but there was a concept of making an impacts catalog where perhaps we could bring some of this down to a level that's referable, where you could pull something off the shelf, know that if XYZ happens, then this will be the outcome. I think that's something maybe if you guys reflect on. I mean, you will continue to say, well, there needs to be an interpretive layer. Maybe challenging the idea that you can have something fixed. I'll throw that out there for the rest of the panelists to chew on. Is it possible to export some of the human capability into something fixed and referable? And otherwise, just also open to your interpretations in response to your initial question. Kevin, how about we go to you? I feel like your face had several different expressions as all of that discussion was going on.
I'm probably not well placed, to be honest, to provide much guidance in this matter. Just from the role that I have, not a lot of familiarity, so I might leave it to sort of David maybe or Ashley.
Thank you. Yeah, David, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing, and this may not be exactly to your last question, Kim, but back to Brian's question. One thing that I think is hard for us to quantify, and I know that both Ashley and I have, Ashley and I are both on the very pro-professionalization side of emergency management. But there is tremendous institutional knowledge that a lot of people have that have lived and worked in a location for a long time. You know, like I said, as I work a lot with very rural emergency managers that have very low resources, very few of them have gone to college. Very few of them have any formal training. And yet they know a lot. They understand a lot. They understand how to interpret things, how to take what they see from the weather service or from media and apply it to their location because they've lived it for such a long time, and they understand their individual community. And so I think there's a level of education or knowledge like that that is very hard for us to quantify. And because of where we sit, we're very biased toward higher education degrees and official training and things like that. But there is definitely a level of weather knowledge that is just based on I've lived in this place for a long time. I've seen this for a long time. I know how to get my community prepared. And I think that's really difficult for us to quantify.
Absolutely. Yeah, tough to set some of that down without an interpretive layer. Ashley, do you have any thoughts that you want to add to that conversation?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of elaborate on what he was saying about using past experience. And I definitely think that that's helpful. One of my biggest concerns, though, is with climate change and how we're starting to have storms that don't act like they used to, or we're starting to have different situations where we've never seen it. And so that's kind of something I like to emphasize to emergency managers who tend to want to use their experience over maybe models or data and remind them, well, you know, we might have some different scenarios or different things that are going on over the next 10 years that you don't have experience seeing. You know, you've never had that tornado outbreak, or you've never had that heavy rain from that tropical system. So I think it's really important too that we continue to kind of push for that. I already talked a lot about training, so that's kind of my standpoint, is just trying to empower our field to be able to work with the subject matter experts, trust the meteorologists, use the data, and better understand what they're given. Because I think that all of those products are getting a lot better and they're coming into the table for emergency management, but I still think that we're kind of dropping the ball on being able to apply the products. And I think we could simply solve that without having a middleman like us by just providing training and standardization of that to every emergency manager so they know what they're doing when they get that forecast. So that's kind of how I see fixing it. Obviously, there's a lot of challenge with that, like he was saying, with accessibility, especially in the rural communities. And luckily, I know FEMA Emergency Management Institute, EMI, is trying to do their EMI Anywhere program. So they're looking at expanding EMI campuses across the country, all for that reason. So hopefully we can keep pushing on that and provide some really helpful training and resources to our emergency managers who have to be able to analyze and apply all this information.
Yes, so one possible path, make better use, more productive use of the human resources that are available. Well, that was all really insightful. Thank you all so much for those thoughts. Beth, I thought at this point, maybe I could turn this back to you for any closing questions, comments, or thoughts.
Thank you, Kim. And thank you so much to our panelists. It's been so interesting listening to your perspectives and your experiences, and you know, your thoughts on what's working and what needs some improving. And that's really why we wanted to hear from you, because when we talk about having successful warnings and all of the things that need to be part of that, that functioning, highly well-functioning link between the experts in the weather and the hazards and the experts on the responder side just needs to work. And if there's things that we can learn or experiences that you can bring to this discussion on what we need to do to make it even better, you know, like the training that Ashley's been talking about, for example, that's the kind of thing that we would like to then promote through the WMO project that we're working on as well. Yeah, so again, maybe we could all come off of mute and give a round of applause to our panelists today. this has been recorded, so we'll make it available on YouTube, and you can please do share it with colleagues who haven't been able to come along today, because I think there was a lot of gold really in this discussion. So we might finish off with our panel discussion here. Those people who are members of the project team, it'd be great if you can stay on, and we'll just do a little bit of project business for the next couple of minutes. But yes,
Nice to
thanks
meet you
everyone
all.
for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you.
Those for whom it's very late, go to bed. We appreciate you. Now go sleep. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So let's turn off this recording.